Good morning, folks. We're going to talk for a few minutes about the next chapter that pertains to fallacies in our textbook. I like to lump all of these fallacies into a broad category of what I would call inductive fallacies, or errors of induction. Now, the author of the text aptly explains that almost all of these fallacies in this chapter could be loosely fit into a broad category that we simply call a hasty conclusion or a hasty generalization. Now, because students oftentimes use hasty conclusion as a catch-all, I will be asking you that unless there is no more specific way to describe the error, please do not use hasty conclusion. In other words, try to get as specific with your fallacy designation as you can. Now, let me explain hasty conclusion or hasty generalization. I think I've already briefly discussed what a generalization is when we discussed induction. Remember, folks, whenever we induce a conclusion, we gather information or make observations. And if the conclusion, the generalization that we're going to draw, is a decent one, the evidence that we gather had better be believable, if you prefer the word true. It had better be sufficient. In other words, you have to have enough information. And then finally, the evidence that you gather has to be relevant. Now, I'm admittedly trying to explain this more thoroughly than the textbook does. Now, whenever we make a hasty generalization, typically, the evidence that we've gathered is, in fact, true. So it's met that standard. Typically, the evidence that we've gathered is also relevant. In other words, there is some connection between the alleged evidence and the conclusion that we're trying to draw. Where the hasty generalization fails is sufficiency. In other words, we haven't actually gathered enough evidence. Now, this leads to another question that the text doesn't discuss. How do I know whether the evidence gathered is sufficient enough? Well, my not so specific answer is this. It all depends upon the kind of conclusion that you're trying to draw. As one of our compadres put it a few minutes ago, suppose that I am saying, well, you can't trust so-and-so because he lies continuously. Now, indeed, if a person has a near continuous record of being a liar, that would be sufficient for saying, well, perhaps we would be wise not to trust this guy too much. However, suppose that Smith was caught in a lie one time in his public life, but he has in general been what? Trustworthy. If a person would pull out that one instance and try to draw a generalization about his character, we would have drawn a hasty generalization. Yeah, we would have drawn a hasty generalization. Yeah, a case of one. Now, let me give you another little example of this. One company that sells cars online has a billboard not far from here, and they also advertise this. They say, is it really a good idea to decide on whether or not you want a car based upon a 7-minute test drive? You may have seen this billboard. And they said, this is why you get to hold on to the car for 7 days and then make a decision. What their argument is basically suggesting that people tend to make hasty generalizations after a short test drive and a hard sell and whatever else. Now, indeed, spending a little more time with your motor vehicle will give you a better sense for whether you're likely to like it or not in the long term. However, 7 days will not likely tell you about its long-term reliability, etc., etc. This is why we go to other reliable sources to try to get that kind of information. But the idea here is we make hasty generalizations when we draw a conclusion too quickly based upon likely trustworthy and relevant, but insufficient information. I'll give you one more little example. Suppose a student has demonstrated with a very good track record that he or she turns in homework on time, has shown up to class every single day, done all the classwork, and all of a sudden, the student disappears for a week. Guess what generalization I draw? I don't draw the generalization, oh, this person must be a lazy bum. This is because I draw the conclusion about a person's behavior based upon their past track record. And the more of a track record you have with a person, the better generalization you can draw. And by the way, I'm generally correct in cases of this. Oh, so-and-so was sick, or so-and-so had a meltdown at home. And I know that meltdowns at home can be the absolute worst and can actually keep you from doing absolutely everything, including checking emails and things of that nature. So yeah, we can draw reasonable generalizations if we make sure that the amount of information that we've gathered to draw the generalization is sufficient. Now remember this, I did say that these are inductive. So remember, we can only have reliable generalizations. We can never have valid generalizations in the sense of deduction. This is why when I speak of arguments from induction, I speak of arguments from strong induction versus arguments from weak induction. Arguments from weak induction typically have rather insufficient evidence. Well, we're going to talk more about some of these fallacies in our next meeting. Cheers.